It began with the sound of shovels cutting through frozen soil and the faint glint of metal beneath the Siberian permafrost. In 2021, a team of Russian and Norwegian researchers uncovered a buried bunker, sealed, silent, and forgotten for over 60 years. Its walls were lined with frostbitten steel, its corridors heavy with the smell of fuel and decay. Stenciled across a rusted door were the words, Object 742. Inside, they found sealed canisters, scattered lab notes, and a name that had been erased from every Soviet record. Operation Ashfall. What was once buried by order of the Kremlin was about to resurface, bringing with it a story of secrecy, science, and the invisible wars fought in the shadows of the Cold War. Chapter 1. Shadows before the storm. Before the Cold War. Before the wall of silence that split the world in two, there was only the long shadow of the Second World War. Europe was broken, its cities blackened and skeletal. Moscow stood victorious, but the victory came at a cost that could never be counted in numbers. 27 million Soviet lives, whole towns gone, generations erased. The Red Army had marched from the ruins of Stalingrad to the heart of Berlin. And in the process, it learned a truth that would shape the decades to come. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on secrets. In 1945, as the Allies divided Germany, Soviet intelligence teams moved quietly through the wreckage. Their orders came directly from the Kremlin's Science Directorate. Collect everything. No detail too small, no technology too strange. They confiscated documents, dismantled laboratories, and sent thousands of German scientists eastward, under what would later be called Operation Osoaviakim. Engines, jet turbines, biological samples, experimental radar, even entire workshops were loaded onto trains bound for Siberia. The war had ended, but another race had already begun. The West had its own prizes. The United States had Operation Paperclip, a secret effort to bring Nazi scientists to America. Men who once built weapons for Hitler now worked in the deserts of New Mexico and the laboratories of Maryland. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union, their counterparts vanished into sealed institutes marked with numbers instead of names. Science became the new front line, and fear, not ideology, was the engine driving both sides. The people of Russia knew little of this. To them, the war was over. Factories rebuilt, families returned from the front. Propaganda films promised peace and progress, showing smiling workers and harvests rising from the ashes. But in the Arctic, far from the cities, construction began on something that didn't exist on any map. The official documents called it a weather research base. The locals knew only that soldiers came by the hundreds, that trainloads of materials arrived in the night, and that the perimeter was marked with warning signs and watchtowers. Novaya Zemlya, a frozen archipelago between the Barents and Kara Seas, had always been a place of exile, a land where the cold itself was a barrier to the world beyond. But to Soviet planners, that isolation was a gift. Beneath its ice, they built laboratories, bunkers, and testing facilities so remote that even the men who worked there barely understood what they were part of. It was here, years later, that Object 740 would take shape, the facility at the heart of Operation Ashfall. The post-war years brought a sense of unease to every nation touched by conflict. The atomic bomb had rewritten the rules of power. No longer was strength measured in armies or tanks, but in equations, and the ability to manipulate forces invisible to the human eye. Across the Soviet Union, teams of scientists worked under intense secrecy to bridge the gap between what was known and what might be possible. Weather manipulation, biological research, radiation studies, all under the justification of defense. The United States was doing the same, and every rumor of progress from one side sent the other into a quiet panic. For the men and women chosen to serve in these secret programs, patriotism often outweighed fear. They believed they were protecting their homeland from another catastrophe. But in those dimly lit corridors, the lines between progress and danger blurred. Notes went missing. Colleagues were reassigned without explanation. And sometimes, entire projects disappeared overnight, leaving behind only locked doors and a silence that no one dared to question. One such project, hidden beneath layers of code names and false designations, would later surface as Operation Ashfall. It began with a simple idea: to understand how atmospheric particles could influence weather on a global scale. The potential was enormous. Control the climate, and you could control agriculture, supply routes, even the enemy's morale. But in the race for supremacy, the risks were ignored. By the early 1950s, the world had entered a new kind of war. One fought not with bullets, but with knowledge, espionage, and fear. In Washington, the CIA was born. In Moscow, the KGB replaced the old security apparatus, tasked with ensuring that nothing, and no one, betrayed the state. Information became currency, and secrecy became the new religion. While most of the world looked toward reconstruction, in the Arctic, under ice and concrete, a handful of scientists began their work in isolation. The records that survive are fragmentary. Redacted orders, half-burned letters, unmarked shipping manifests, but they tell a consistent story. Something extraordinary was being built, something that combined meteorology, biology, and nuclear physics in ways no civilian scientist could have imagined. What exactly they hoped to achieve remains buried in conflicting reports. Some claimed it was an experiment to disperse radioactive particles to study wind currents. Others whispered of an attempt to create localized climatic effects, storms on command. The truth, as always, was likely somewhere in between. But one fact was certain. No one outside that frozen compound ever saw the full picture. Each scientist knew only a fraction, each engineer a piece of the mechanism. Compartmentalization, they called it. Protection from espionage and from conscience. From the cities to the tundra, from Berlin's ruins to Moscow's corridors, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. Invisible, relentless, and without front lines, the Cold War was not declared in speeches or parades. It began quietly, in places like Object 742, where the cold wasn't the only thing that froze, where truth itself was locked away beneath the ice. Chapter 2: The Architects of Secrecy. By 1949, the tension between superpowers had hardened into something permanent. Washington tested its first hydrogen bomb. Moscow answered in kind. The age of visible war had ended, replaced by laboratories, control rooms, and the silent hum of reactors buried beneath the earth. Inside the Kremlin, scientists were no longer just researchers. They were soldiers in white coats. Men like Colonel Viktor Mikhailovich Orlov, head of the Soviet Meteorological Weapons Directorate, understood this better than anyone. To him, weather was not chaos. It was a system waiting to be mastered. The orders came through encrypted telegrams. Build a facility capable of simulating the atmospheric conditions of a nuclear detonation. The aim was simple: predict fallout. The real purpose was anything but. Orlov assembled a team of physicists, chemists, and biologists, many of them Germans, taken from post-war internment camps. The team was told they were designing a new kind of environmental monitoring system. In reality, Operation Ashfall was conceived to test how microscopic particles could carry radiation and possibly disease across continents. Most of the scientists never questioned the contradictions. They had seen the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They knew the stakes. Some convinced themselves they were preventing another catastrophe. Others, simply following orders, buried their doubts beneath layers of calculation and silence. In a declassified memorandum dated April 3, 1954, Orlov wrote, "Our goal is to render climate a strategic variable. The Americans have already begun." Whether that was true or paranoia is still debated, but the belief itself was enough to justify everything that followed. The new base was chosen for its remoteness, a site 200 kilometers north of any settlement, reachable only by sea during a narrow summer window. It would operate under the codename Object 742. Workers, many of them prisoners from the gulags, labored through brutal winters, carving tunnels into the permafrost and pouring reinforced concrete by torchlight. When the last ship left before winter, the men inside knew they would not see sunlight again for months. Above them, the aurora drifted silently over the frozen sea, painting the night in electric green. Inside, life followed a rhythm of routine and control. Every door required a passcode. Every letter home was censored. The corridors echoed with the hum of ventilation and the low crackle of shortwave radios. Yet beneath that mechanical order, unease spread like frost. The facility's lower levels were sealed, accessible only to Orlov and a handful of senior officers. Rumors spread of experiments involving aerosol dispersal, animal testing, and prolonged exposure studies. The few who questioned orders were reassigned to remote stations or simply disappeared from the rosters. Outside the Soviet Union, the West was building its own mirrors of secrecy. In the Nevada desert, American scientists detonated nuclear devices under the guise of meteorological research. In the Pacific, Britain tested its first bombs. Every detonation fed data into the same invisible competition. Who could understand and manipulate the forces that governed the planet itself? Back in Moscow, Politburo minutes from 1956 describe a growing fear. The United States had launched high-altitude weather balloons carrying radiation sensors. To the Soviets, it looked like reconnaissance. Or worse, preparation for atmospheric warfare. If they can see our skies, one minister said, they can control them. That fear gave Orlov the funding he needed to push Ashfall into its next phase. In the spring of 1958, project director Anatoly Zhukov, a young physicist from Leningrad, began testing aerosolized compounds under simulated jet stream conditions. Declassified fragments of his notes speak of metallic dispersants, thermal bloom events, and unexpected biological interference. It's unclear what he meant by that last phrase, but within weeks 3 technicians were reported ill. The official cause, pneumonia. The facility's internal report, later recovered in the 2021 excavation, listed respiratory failure of unknown origin. Zhukov's diary, found decades later in a sealed locker, offers the only personal account of what was happening inside. In one entry dated June 12, 1958, he wrote, "We have crossed a line I can no longer define. The air in the lower chamber is alive. The readings are off scale. Orlov says we proceed anyway." Days later, his entries stop. Then came the silence. Soviet records indicate that Object 742 went off-grid in November of 1959. The official explanation was a structural collapse following seismic activity, but the seismic readings from that region show no such event. Instead, a classified transmission intercepted by British intelligence, decrypted only decades later, reported the activation of Protocol Ashfall, an emergency containment directive authorizing destruction of all materials, biological and otherwise. The message was transmitted once and never acknowledged again. What happened inside the facility remains uncertain. Some historians believe a containment breach released experimental aerosols, forcing the site to be sealed under tons of rock and snow. Others suggest a deliberate cover-up, that Orlov and his team were ordered to erase all evidence of a failed experiment that violated the 1925 Geneva Protocol. When the Cold War thawed, the files should have surfaced. They didn't. Orlov's name vanished from personnel registries. Zhukov's records were redacted in full. Even references to Object 742 were removed from topographical maps by the 1970s. The Arctic reclaimed the land, the permafrost grew thicker, and the facility became a rumor whispered among intelligence analysts and historians alike, a ghost story of the nuclear age. But beneath that ice, the silence wasn't empty. In 2021, the world would learn that what the Soviets buried was not just a facility, but a secret born of fear, ambition, and the quiet desperation of men who believed they could command the sky itself. Chapter 3: The Frozen Cataclysm. The wind howled over Novaya Zemlya like a living thing. Snow drifted across the barren plateau, piling against the few structures that rose above the tundra. It was February 1960, months after Object 742 had gone silent, and the Arctic sun barely touched the horizon. A rescue convoy moved through the frozen wasteland, 2 tracked vehicles, a radio truck, and a dozen men wrapped in layers of wool and fear. Their orders were simple: locate the research team, secure the site, and recover any data for the Ministry of Defense. But what they found would never reach Moscow. Captain Pavel Andreev led the unit. A veteran of Stalingrad, he knew the look of death, but nothing prepared him for this. As the convoy neared the coordinates, the landscape changed. The ice was scorched black in long arcs, as if something had burned through the snow from beneath. Instruments flickered, compass needles spun, the Geiger counters began to chatter. Soft at first, then wild, Andreev ordered a halt. They advanced on foot, through a field of twisted metal and shattered antennae. The main bunker entrance was half collapsed, its steel doors buckled outward. It looked less like an explosion and more like something inside had forced its way out. The men hesitated. Then, with a groan of hinges frozen in place, they pried the hatch open. The smell hit them first. Metallic, chemical, and strangely sweet. The air inside shimmered with fine dust that glittered in their flashlights. The walls were coated in frost, but beneath it, streaks of dark residue ran toward the floor drains. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. On a console near the entrance, a message had been scrawled in grease pencil. "Do not descend." They did anyway. The lower levels were intact, powered by a generator still humming faintly. Paper logs fluttered in the draft, stamped with the facility's emblem. A black circle crossed by 3 lines. Laboratory tables lay overturned, glass vials shattered. In one chamber, they found cages of frozen animals. Rats, birds, and what appeared to be stray dogs. Some had been tagged for study. Others were fused to the ice, caught mid-movement, as if flash-frozen. Then they found the central lab. Rows of cylindrical tanks lined the walls, their glass sides frosted opaque. Andreev wiped one clear with his glove and froze. Inside was what looked like a mannequin, but the details were wrong. The skin was pale, waxy, eyes open. Human. The tag on the tank read simply, "Test Subject 12BR." Nearby, a clipboard listed dosages, exposure times, and a column of handwritten notes ending abruptly in smudged ink. Someone had been working there until the very end. The lieutenant beside him crossed himself, whispering that they should leave. Andreev gave the order to photograph everything, to take samples. They needed proof, for the report, for themselves. Yet as they worked, the generator faltered. The lights flickered. A low hum began to pulse through the floor. Steady, rhythmic, like breathing. Then the radios screamed. High-pitched feedback filled their ears. The operator shouted that the frequency was being jammed, though they were hundreds of kilometers from any known station. One by one, the lights went out, leaving only the dull orange glow of emergency bulbs. In that silence, Andreev heard the faint hiss of air, the sound of a seal breaking somewhere deep below. The temperature began to rise. Later, fragments of his field journal would describe what followed. A chemical mist rising through the vents, the smell of metal, men coughing, stumbling. "We tried to seal the doors." The last entry read, "We lit the charges. God forgive us." The explosion that followed registered faintly on seismic sensors in Murmansk, mistaken at the time for ice shelf movement. The ministry filed it away. No recovery teams were sent. Object 742 was officially declared a total loss due to environmental collapse. The site was buried under an artificial avalanche triggered by remote charges, sealing it beneath 40 meters of snow and rock. But the story didn't end there. For decades, Western intelligence analysts puzzled over intercepted transmissions from Soviet Arctic Command, short bursts of data, irregular and indecipherable. In 1963, an American reconnaissance satellite recorded heat signatures consistent with a reactor still running. Despite the base's destruction, then nothing. The signal vanished, and the ice reclaimed the land once more. Inside the Soviet Union, whispers persisted among those who knew the project's real name, Ashfall. It became shorthand for a lesson in hubris, an experiment that burned itself out. Orlov was recalled to Moscow and quietly reassigned. Zhukov's family received a letter of commendation for his service to science. No remains were ever returned. Officially, Operation Ashfall never existed. Unofficially, it haunted every conversation about Arctic research for the next 20 years. Engineers sent to Novaya Zemlya for nuclear testing spoke of strange compass deviations, of radio interference that began whenever drilling reached a certain depth. Some claimed to hear machinery beneath the ice, others refused to speak at all. When the Cold War ended, access to the region opened briefly to Western scientists. They found traces of infrastructure, tunnels, foundations, fragments of Soviet signage. But the heart of Object 742 remained buried, unreachable. Attempts to drill down met with unexplained instrument failure, as if the ice itself resisted intrusion. And then, in 2021, a small drone surveying permafrost layers near the Kara coast recorded something impossible, a faint heat bloom emanating from beneath 40 meters of solid ice. The temperature anomaly was localized, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. When the excavation began months later, the research team expected old fuel or trapped geothermal gas. What they uncovered instead was a steel hatch, its surface engraved with Cyrillic script and the faded insignia of the Meteorological Weapons Directorate. Inside lay the remnants of a world frozen in time, papers, equipment, and the final, desperate attempts of scientists who had gone too far. As one archaeologist put it in her field notes, the cold preserved everything, except the truth. That was the moment Operation Ashfall was reborn, and with it, the chilling realization that the line between science and weapon had always been thinner than ice. Chapter 5. What Remains of the Ash. Decades have passed since the discovery of Operation Ashfall, yet the echoes of that frozen secret continue to reverberate through history. The files are archived, the site sealed, and the world has moved on, or so it seems. But beneath the official silence, the legacy of Object 742 lingers like a shadow stretching across time. Scientists still debate what the Soviets truly achieved there. Historians still argue over whether the project was a failed experiment or a weapon that succeeded too well to be acknowledged. The truth, like the ice that hid it for 60 years, refuses to melt completely. The most striking realization came not from military analysts, but from climate researchers. When atmospheric samples from Novaya Zemlya were compared to global data collected since the 1960s, faint traces of metallic compounds appeared. Compounds that shouldn't exist naturally, matching those listed in the Ashfall laboratory notes. In the smallest ways, the world had been breathing its residue for decades. It wasn't proof of catastrophe, but it was proof of presence. The Arctic, it seemed, had been whispering its secret into every gust of wind. For the men and women who dedicated their lives to uncovering this story, the hardest part wasn't the science, it was the humanity. The deeper they looked, the clearer the moral fog became. How far would any nation go when it feels surrounded by enemies? How much knowledge is too dangerous to possess? The Cold War may have ended on paper, but the mentality, that endless pursuit of control, still defines global ambition today. Satellites now monitor every cloud formation, every atmospheric fluctuation. We claim it's for forecasting, but history reminds us the line between observation and manipulation has always been a fragile one. Dr. Ingrid Kjær still keeps a piece of that history in her office, a fragment of scorched metal from the bunker's outer wall. "It's just steel," she once said in an interview, her voice quiet. "But when I hold it, I feel the weight of silence." She's not alone in that feeling. Across Europe and Russia, exhibitions now display artifacts from Object 742 sealed glass vials, pages of data filled with Cyrillic equations, a faded Soviet uniform patch with the words atmospheric division. People stop, stare, and wonder what kind of world demanded such secrecy. Perhaps the answer lies in fear. The 20th century was defined by it. The fear of annihilation, the fear of falling behind, the fear that peace itself was a trap. Every empire has its hidden laboratories, every superpower its ghosts. Operation Ashfall wasn't unique in that sense. It was simply the most extreme expression of a universal truth. When knowledge and power converge, morality becomes negotiable. Yet there's something unexpectedly human buried in that tragedy. The diary entries recovered from the base, particularly those of Anatoly Zhukov, reveal a man torn between duty and conscience. He wrote of frostbite and fatigue, of laughter during power outages, of colleagues sharing cigarettes in the corridor and speaking quietly about home. Amid the machinery and madness, they were still human, still clinging to fragments of ordinary life. Their letters, never delivered, spoke of hope. When the experiment ends, we'll return to Moscow. The city will be green again. It never ended. The snow became their grave. Today, the Arctic is changing faster than ever. Ice that once preserved the world's secrets now melts year by year, revealing wreckage, bones, and forgotten machines. The past is surfacing, and with it, questions we no longer have the luxury to ignore. How many other ashfalls lie buried beneath the ice, beneath deserts, beneath our oceans? What else did we bury to protect ourselves from the truth? Governments call it progress. Historians call it pattern. Every generation builds its own Object 742 call. A place where secrecy and science intertwine, justified by words like security and advancement. And every generation eventually learns the same lesson. That control is an illusion, and nature keeps its own memory. Standing at the site today, the air feels unnaturally still. The snow covers everything. The ruins, the scaffolds, even the warning signs. Yet deep beneath, the ground still exhales warmth, as if the earth itself remembers. The scientists who rediscovered it have long since moved on, But their footage remains, grainy, haunting, framed by the hum of Arctic wind. The camera pans across the final chamber, over the rusted tanks and the walls marked by frost, then lingers on a single inscription etched into metal. Ashfall ends when silence begins. Maybe that was their final message, or their confession. History doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. It waits in fragments and frozen soil, in archives and whispered stories, waiting for those willing to listen. Operation Ashfall is more than a tale of Soviet ambition. It's a warning written in ice that secrecy, once buried, always finds a way back to the surface. And when it does, it doesn't just reveal the past, it reveals us. In the end, all that remains of Operation Ashfall is silence. But within that silence lies a question that refuses to fade. If knowledge is power, what price are we still willing to pay for it? Chapter 4: Silence Beneath the Ice. In the months after the 2021 discovery, the world watched with quiet fascination as the permafrost gave up its secrets. News footage showed cranes lifting corroded canisters out of the Arctic soil, their stenciled, markings still legible. Ministry of Defense, property of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The world had seen its share of forgotten relics, crashed bombers, sealed bunkers, wrecked submarines, but nothing like this. Inside the containers were laboratory journals, glass ampoules, and the faded remains of air filtration masks. Everything had been preserved, locked in a kind of frozen stasis for 6 decades. At first, Russian authorities denied involvement. Then came the press release, brief, formal, and deeply cautious. The statement described the site as an abandoned meteorological outpost of no further concern. But the images told another story. Photographs leaked by Norwegian researchers showed symbols of the Soviet Defense Science Directorate. Notes written in both Russian and German. And that emblem, a black circle crossed by 3 lines, reappearing on every document tied to Operation Ashfall. The world's media began piecing the puzzle together. The Guardian ran the headline, "Frozen Lab in the Arctic, Russia's Forgotten Experiment." Within hours, social media filled with speculation, chemical weapons, nuclear fallout research, even rumors of disease testing. But for the people on site, it wasn't speculation. It was danger. Radiation sensors ticked softly at first, then rose into warning levels as the team broke through the bunker's final chamber. The air smelled faintly metallic, the same scent Captain Andreev had written about in his 1960 journal, the scent of something that should have remained sealed. Dr. Ingrid Kjær, a climatologist from Oslo, kept an audio log of the excavation. Her voice, calm, deliberate, narrated the discovery as if aware that she was documenting history. We've entered a room that appears untouched. The walls are lined with pressure tanks, each labeled in Cyrillic and numerical code. There's condensation inside the glass. The temperature is rising faster than expected. It feels wrong to be here. Later that evening, one of the researchers developed respiratory symptoms. He was evacuated immediately. Within days, the camp was sealed. Moscow intervened, citing biohazard risk, and ordered all foreign personnel to withdraw. The remaining evidence was flown out under military guard. Officially, no contamination was confirmed. Unofficially, the quarantine lasted 6 weeks. Back home, Kjær refused to stay silent. In an interview months later, she said softly, "The documents weren't just scientific, they were administrative, sign-off sheets, orders, and death records. Someone authorized human testing in that place." Her words sparked outrage. Within a week, both Russian and Western intelligence agencies denied her claims, labeling them unsubstantiated and politically motivated. She received anonymous emails warning her to stop revising history. She didn't. Meanwhile, historians combed through declassified Soviet archives, searching for corroboration. They found faint traces, budget reports with missing figures, internal memos referring to Project 742 and northern containment efforts. Nothing explicit, but enough to confirm one thing. The operation existed, and the cover-up was deliberate. Then came the most chilling revelation. Among the materials recovered from the ice was a reel of magnetic tape, labeled in red ink, Meridian Test, 12th of June 1958. The same date as Zhukov's final diary entry. When restored by sound engineers in Moscow, the recording produced a sequence of static and faint, distorted voices, scientists reading coordinates, describing atmospheric pressure, and then a phrase repeated several times. Thermal anomaly confirmed, initiating dispersal. The tape cut off abruptly after a minute of mechanical noise. No explosion, no panic, just silence. For weeks, investigators debated whether to release the recording to the public. Some argued it was meaningless, a routine test. Others feared what it implied, that the Soviets had conducted full-scale aerosol experiments in the upper atmosphere using materials no one could now identify. If so, it meant Operation Ashfall wasn't an accident. It was a test gone too far. As evidence mounted, so did the human toll. Descendants of missing Soviet scientists came forward with stories. Families told their relatives had died in transport or perished in the line of service. In truth, many had been reassigned to the Arctic in the late 1950s and never returned. Their names never appeared on any memorial. For decades, their families lived with silence, a silence heavier than grief. In the final phase of excavation, researchers uncovered a small storage locker near the command room. Inside were personal belongings, a pipe, a leather-bound notebook, and a photograph of a group of men standing in snow, smiling, bundled in heavy coats. The back of the photograph bore a single handwritten word: Ashfall. It was the only surviving image of the people who built and died within Object 742. What haunts the story is not the technology itself, but the humanity buried alongside it. Scientists driven by loyalty, soldiers obeying orders, families told nothing. The weight of secrecy consumed them all. And for what? The data, if it survived, was never used. Whatever they learned from the Arctic winds was swallowed by the Cold War's endless hunger for advantage. Today, the site remains sealed under reinforced ice barriers. Visitors are prohibited. On official maps, the coordinates mark a geological hazard zone. The earth beneath still radiates faint warmth, a ghost of the energy once released there. Local hunters call it the Warm Hill. They say the snow around it never fully settles, that sometimes on still nights they hear a low hum rising through the permafrost. No one knows if that's true. But the silence that follows, the silence left by those who tried to rewrite the sky, is as real as the cold itself. It stretches across generations, across borders, reminding us that history doesn't simply vanish beneath ice. It waits, preserved, patient, and unforgiving.